Hey guys, all right, we are back with our lecture notes. The way this is going to work for chapter one is there's actually not too many notes here, so we'll be able to move pretty quickly through our slides, through the information that you're going to need, and then we will kind of move on with our next test and head right into our first civilization of the year. One of the things that we're going to do with this unit is I will be also having us do some notes in class. So a lot of these notes are going to be review and are being posted with the idea that we've already talked about some of these things and that we are reviewing. Um, so no need right now for discussion questions yet, although that might change depending on how things kind of move um, in class and stuff. So, chapter one deals with the beginnings of civilization, and it starts with a conversation around how we understand the past. Here, you can actually see this is Lucy. This is Lucy's fossil. You can see that the tan uh, bones there are the actual original fossilized records. The rest are plaster casts based off of the findings to match. So we've already talked about some of this stuff already, so we're going to kind of move again quickly through that. But I kind of want to just touch on some things that your book mentions that we haven't really talked about in a ton of detail just yet. So our objective for this first section of chapter one is to look at historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and understand what do they do, how are their jobs similar, how are their jobs different. So in order to kind of get into this uh, world, let's first start by talking about prehistory. Okay. um, yes, there is something called prehistory, and we should take a minute and think about what this is. So when people refer to something that is prehistoric, right, that's what the adjective related to prehistory, what are they talking about? They're talking about things that existed before history. Makes sense. Prehistory, before history. But that leads us to a question as to what is history, which we'll get to in a second. So there are two main fields that um, study prehistory. One is anthropology. Anthropology uh, is the study of the culture, origins, and societies of human groups. Um, there are modern anthropologists, there are paleoanthropologists, there are anthropologists who go out into the field and study uncontacted tribes in South America. There are anthropologists who study how humans live in cities. There are anthropologists who study many things related to human culture. Anthropology actually comes from the Greek words, the ology or logos, which is what we say study of, or more probably appropriate is the logic of, the order of, the logic of. And then anthropos, or anthropo, comes from anthropos, which is the Greek word for man, for human. So if you hear people talking about like a philanthropist, um, right, the anthropo shows up there again. And we should know from Philadelphia that philo means love. So a philanthropist is someone who loves humans, which is why they donate a lot of money. But anthropology, again, study of man, right? That's basically what anthropology means, and more specifically, culture. And culture are the beliefs, values, and practices of a human group. So we can think about examples of American culture, which I'm sure you can rattle off. From I'm expecting you to rattle some of these off during class. Um, so culture is kind of how we view the world, kind of the things that makes our human group unique. Okay. There's another um, field that studies prehistoric times, and that's archaeology. Archaeology looks at things specifically through material remains. Okay. So archaeology is exclusively past peoples, whereas anthropology can be modern day, right? You can have a modern day anthropologist. Well, you can have an anthropologist who's studying modern cultures. That's not going to be the same thing with an archaeologist. Archaeologists are always studying the past, right? People and cultures of the past through material remains. Now, the question is, what is a remain? And how does that compare to an artifact? Okay. A material remain is quite literally anything that was left behind, right? Is anything that remains from that person or that culture. So these can be fossils, they can be pottery shards, they can be bricks, they can be tools, they can be, you name it. It can be anything that was left behind by a society or culture or person, right? So, like I said, fossilized remains. The question gets into what is the difference between a remain and an artifact? Okay. An artifact is a type of remain. All artifacts are remains, not all remains are artifacts. Hopefully, you can take a minute to think about what the difference might be between an artifact and a remain, where the line might be. If we talk about the roots of the word artifact, artificial, artifice, basically these things mean things that were created, right? An artificial environment is something that is created, right? It's opposite of a natural environment, right? An artificial heart valve, right, is something that was created based off of materials not found in nature, right? So an artifact is something that is made by a human. Okay, so a tool is an artifact. Pottery shard, artifact. Brick, artifact. Fossilized bone, not an artifact, right? That is a remain. Remain is the larger group of things studied, I guess, and artifact is a smaller subset. So all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, right? It's the same kind of concept. So, yep, artifact, something that was made by a human that was then left behind. So, both are important. Remains and artifacts are important for uh, the study of archaeology. And when we have these items, it's important that we uh, date the remains. Okay, we figure out how old the remains are. So there's two types of ways that we can do that. One is called relative dating, one is called absolute dating. Okay, absolute dating is finding out exactly how old something is. A technique used for that would be like carbon dating. You can carbon, a certain isotope, which you don't need to know, of carbon decays at a specific rate that can be measured. So you can measure how much carbon something is in something, and that tells you exactly how old it is, right? So this is really useful for things like fossils. Um, Relative dating is you're looking at something based on other people, right? Is something older or younger relative to something else? Okay, there's a relationship. Right? I'm using these words specifically and uh, intentionally, right? There's a relationship between two things. So, for example, absolute dating might be that Holy Ghost, the building at Holy Ghost was built in 1897, right? That is absolute dating. That's exactly how old the school is. Relative dating is Holy Ghost Prep is older than LaSalle College High School. Okay, which I think is true. Pretty sure it's true. So that's an example of relative dating, right? It is based off of a comparison between two things. So technique that we use for absolute dating, again, is carbon dating, measure the carbon. How we do that with relative dating is actually something that hopefully is a little outside the box in the way that we think about this. And that is where is it in the soil? Okay. So hopefully, if you're thinking about this, um, you know, if we're looking at, say, an archaeological dig and we're digging down into the soil, right? Um, let's say we find something 5 meters down under the soil, and then we find something 30 meters down under the soil. Which one's older? Hopefully, you're thinking that the one that's farther down is older, right? And that's true. We look at like the layers of earth and soil that have accumulated over time, right? So the farther down it goes, the older it is. That's an example of a technique used by relative dating, right? Sometimes they bring in a geologist or an earth scientist, right? Someone who specializes in these kinds of things to help archaeologists, but most archaeologists are able to do that themselves with their training. Okay, let's talk about the reason why this course is called World History, and that is, let's talk about historians. So historians study and write about the historical past, okay? And again, we have a question here. What is the historical past? Is it just everything that's ever existed? No. There's a certain line that historians use, okay? And that is by analyzing the written record. Before writing, there is no history. That is the line of history to prehistory. Okay, prehistory is human events before writing. It is not all things that happened before. So this is also something important to get down. When we talk about history, we are always talking about humans. Okay, you can think of it as his story, right? Man's story, the story of us. So historians study humans. Dinosaurs are not part of history. Pangea is not part of history, right? These are things that happened long before human beings or any member, whether that's Homo erectus or any of the members of our genus after, came to be. So when we're talking about history, we're talking about the written record, right? So everything that's happened from the written record. So until writing, there was no history. Now, unlike archaeology and anthropology, where you're using a lot of artifacts, historians use artifacts too, but because they're focused on the written word, there's a lot of questions that come into play that aren't necessarily going to show up with, like, say, a bunch of fossils that were found by an archaeologist. And that is this thing that I'm reading reliable, right? There's a whole set of questions that go into this that are related to bias, right? Who wrote this and what was the intention of that person writing? Was this a journal entry that they were just writing down the things that happened to their day? Was it a tax document that was used for government record keeping purposes? Is it a letter to the local leader asking for help with something? The audience matters when we're talking about the written record. I would imagine that you guys are going to write something differently to me than you would maybe your brother or sister, right? If you were writing an email to me or your brother or sister, I'm imagining that you are going to be more formal with me and less formal with your brother or sister. It'd be weird if it was the other way around. But, right, that's who the audience is in terms of who is writing and who are they writing for, whom are they writing for, is really important. People lie. People are biased. People are sometimes exaggerate things to make it to be a better story, right? So historians have to constantly check, hey, what are the odds that this actually occurred? Is this something that someone just made up, right? Are there other corroborating evidence around that can point to, yes, this event happened, and now we can look at how it was perceived by different members of a human group or society. The other thing that historians do is we tend to focus on the causes. Historians like to try to figure out why something happened. So that goes all the way back to Herodotus. Herodotus wanted to figure out what was going on with the Persian War. And historians since then have always kind of had a focus on the causes of things. What caused the Great Depression? What caused World War II? What caused, anything, right? The Brexit, right? What's causing things is something that historians tend to focus on. And because of that, that's when historians can show their own bias. All humans have bias. We can only see the world from the perspective of our two eyes, right? So the way that we were brought up, this is the society that we were raised in, the socioeconomic background of our families, the country that we live in, right? These are all things that are biasing factors. It doesn't mean that they're bad. Okay, this is important. Bias in history isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Because everyone has it. Everyone looks at things from their own perspective, right? This video might be the most boring thing you've ever watched, but I think it's pretty interesting. I think I'm getting a little excited about this video, right? How can we both be right about that? Well, because we're both coming at it from our own perspectives. So historians, when they write about the past and by focusing on a cause, they at those times can show their bias. If I'm someone who thinks that I, I don't even if I'm someone that thinks that economics plays a major role in American presidential history, well, then I'm going to look at things like the Great Depression as the cause for FDR getting elected to the presidency. If I'm looking at the Civil War, I might look at it from a perspective of economics rather than an issue of slavery, right? Um, is one thing wrong or right? No, it's just how someone approaches a topic. So part of being a historian is one, understanding your own bias, and two is understanding how that affects the work that you're doing. Historians oftentimes acknowledge their bias and are okay with that. Historians don't need to write an encyclopedia that covers things from many different perspectives, right? A historian can write something that is from one perspective only by looking at sources, right? Primary sources, secondary sources that only come from one either school of thought, one background, one demographic type. You can have women's history, African American history, and you name it. You can have histories of many different cultures and subgroups and demographics because they all have their own perspective and they all have their unique perspective. And the great thing about being a historian is the fact that if you do it right, you can combine all of those different perspectives to gain a fuller understanding of the past. And that's really what historians care about is a deep, rich understanding of the past so that it can inform the decisions we make in the present. Right? You've probably heard the saying, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I don't really like that because it makes it sound that history is always bad, right? We can learn from the mistakes of our past and change the way that we do things today and in the future. And to me, that's really the powerful thing of studying history. And it's something I'm really passionate about. But that's it for Chapter 1, Section 1. I told you it was a pretty short section in the textbook. If you want to read along in the book, it is Chapter 1, Section 1. It's just a handful of pages. You will have a textbook reading assignment and a reading quiz that goes along with that as part of this unit. But hopefully that we're able to have good conversations in class about some of these things, and we don't have to worry about those discussion board questions for this. All right, next time we will be talking about how civilization got started. That is the one thing that changed our trajectory from being just another member of the Earth's family to one of the most dominant species that has ever existed on this planet. And that's coming up in the next video. All right, guys, until then,